My father-in-law pushed me down the stairs when I refused to give him $3,000 for a car after supporting him for 4 years. My husband defended him, but I sued and evicted both of them, left them with nothing. I'm 34 years old. I work in accounting for a logistics company, and for 4 years I basically supported two grown men who didn't lift a finger to help me. And when I finally said no, one of them pushed me down the stairs. That simple. That horrible. I guess I should start from the beginning. When I met Brian like 7 years ago, because back then everything seemed normal. You know? He had a job, paid his bills, was independent. His dad Arthur lived alone in an apartment on the other side of town, and we'd see him on special occasions, Christmas, birthdays, that kind of thing. We got married after 2 years of dating, bought a house together. Well, technically I bought it because my credit was better and I had the down payment saved, but at the time it didn't seem important. We were a team, right? The thing is that like 6 months after the wedding, Arthur lost his job at a furniture factory where he'd worked for years. Something about layoffs or the company closing. I don't remember. Exactly. And Brian suggested that his dad move in with us temporarily while he found something new. I agreed because, it's his dad. What was I going to say? I thought it would be for a few months maximum. Those months turned into a year, and that year turned into 4 full years. Arthur never got another job. Didn't even really try, honestly. And Brian kind of gradually lost motivation too. First, he quit his job saying he was too stressed and needed a break, which, fine, we all need breaks sometimes. But that break turned into 6 months, then a year, then 2 years. He tried doing some freelance work here and there, graphic design because he'd studied something related in college, but he never lasted more than a couple weeks with a client before some problem or some excuse came up. Meanwhile, I kept working, getting up at 6 in the morning every day, going to the office, doing overtime when necessary, and coming home to find these two guys on the couch watching TV, surrounded by dirty dishes and empty beer cans. And the house was always a mess, and when I'd ask them to at least clean up a little, they'd tell me they were tired or they'd do it later, but later never came. The worst part wasn't just that they didn't work, it was that I paid for absolutely everything. Rent, utilities, food, internet, cable, everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. Brian stopped having his own money like 3 years ago, and Arthur obviously didn't have anything either because he didn't work. So anything they needed, cigarettes, beer, gas for the car that was technically mine but they used more than me, came out of my bank account. I calculated once, because I'm an accountant and I like to have clear numbers. And between everything I was spending on maintaining the two of them plus my own expenses, I was paying like $4,000 a month. Like, that's not counting extra stuff. $4,000 every month for 4 years? Can you imagine how much money that is? I could have bought another car. I could have gone on vacation. I could have saved for the future. But no, I was supporting two perfectly capable adult men who had simply decided it was easier to live off me. What really bothered me, more than the money even, was the lack of gratitude. Arthur especially. He acted like I owed him something, like it was my obligation to support him. If I bought a brand of cereal he didn't like, he'd complain. If there was no beer in the fridge, he'd make passive-aggressive comments about how I never thought about other people's needs. One time I told him, "Arthur, if you want a specific brand of something, you can go buy it yourself." And he looked at me like I'd asked him to climb Mount Everest. Brian always defended his dad. Said I was being too hard. That Arthur was older. That he'd worked his whole life and deserved to rest. Rest? Seriously? The guy was 62, not 92. He was perfectly healthy, just lazy and opportunistic. But Brian didn't want to see it. Things reached the breaking point like 3 months ago. Arthur came to my room on a Saturday morning. I was still in my pajamas trying to have a quiet day because I'd worked late all week, and he told me he needed $3,000 for a car. Just like that, like he was asking me to pass the salt. I asked him what car, and he explained that he'd seen a used Honda Civic at a car lot, like a 2015 model or something, and wanted to buy it because he was tired of not having his own vehicle. I just sat there on my bed processing what I'd just heard. Because this man, who hadn't contributed a single cent to household expenses in 4 years, was asking me for an additional $3,000 for a car he definitely didn't need. I told him no, simple and direct. I don't have that extra money. Arthur, I'm already paying for everything else. He insisted, said it was important for his independence, that he couldn't depend on me for everything. And I thought, seriously? Now, you're worried about depending on me? After 4 years? I told him no again, more firmly this time, and explained that if he wanted a car, he needed to get a job and save for it himself. Arthur turned red, literally red in the face, and started yelling at me, saying I was selfish, that family helps each other, that he'd raised Brian alone after his wife left them, that he deserved some respect and consideration. I got up from the bed and told him to get out of my room, that this conversation was over. I walked out behind him into the hallway because I wanted to go to the kitchen to make myself coffee and try to calm down, and then it happened. Arthur was there at the landing of the stairs, still yelling something about how I didn't value everything he'd sacrificed. And when I walked past him to go down the stairs, I felt it, his hands on my back, pushing me hard. I didn't have time to grab the railing or prepare myself. I just fell, rolled down like 10 steps before I could stop myself. I hit my hip against one of the steps, my elbow against another, and ended up on the floor below with my shoulder twisted and unable to breathe properly from the pain and shock. I lay there on the floor for what seemed like minutes but was probably seconds, and the first thing I thought was, did that really just happen? Did he really just push me down the stairs? I heard footsteps. Thought it was Arthur coming down to apologize or to help me, but it was Brian. My husband, the man I'd been married to for 5 years, came down the stairs, looked at me lying there on the floor, clearly hurt. And you know what the first thing he said was? It wasn't, "Are you okay? Or do you need me to call an ambulance?" No, the first thing he said was, "You shouldn't have made my dad angry like that, Natalie." I froze. I said, "Did you hear what happened? Your dad pushed me down the stairs. Brian, he pushed me." And he just shook his head and said I'd been too hard on Arthur, that I knew his dad had a bad temper when he got frustrated, that I should have handled the situation better. Arthur had come down by that point too and was standing there with his arms crossed, not apologizing, not showing even a bit of remorse. I managed to get up. Everything hurt, but I didn't think I had anything broken. Just really bad bruises I knew would appear later. I went up the stairs slowly. Each step was agony, and locked myself in my room. I sat on the bed, shaking. Not just from the physical pain, but from the realization of what had just happened and, more importantly, Brian's reaction. My husband had taken his father's side, the man who had just physically assaulted me, instead of mine. In that moment, I knew I couldn't continue like this, that something had to change radically, because if I stayed in that situation, things were only going to get worse. I grabbed my phone and started looking for hotels nearby. Anything. I just needed to get out of that house. I found a motel like 20 minutes away, nothing fancy, but it looked clean and safe, and I booked a room for a week. Then I pulled out a suitcase from the closet and started packing. Clothes, toiletries, my laptop, important documents I had stored in a drawer, my passport, birth certificates, bank statements. It took me like an hour to pack everything I considered essential, and when I finished, I grabbed the suitcase and left the room. Brian and Arthur were in the living room watching TV. They didn't even look at me when I came down the stairs with the suitcase rolling behind me. I told them, "I'm leaving." And Brian looked up with a confused expression, asking where I was going. I told him I was going to stay at a motel for a while, that I needed space to think. Arthur let out a sarcastic laugh and said something like, "Sure, run away like always," instead of facing problems. I didn't answer him, just opened the door and walked out to my car. As I drove to the motel, the tears started coming. I couldn't control them, 4 years of frustration and anger and exhaustion coming out all at once. I got to the motel, checked in, went up to my room, and threw myself on the bed to cry until I fell asleep. The next day, Monday, I called work and said I was sick, that I needed the day off. Then I Googled lawyers specializing in family law and domestic abuse cases in my area, because I knew what Arthur had done counted as assault, and I also knew I needed legal protection for what came next. I found Sandra, a lawyer with really good reviews who offered free initial consultations, and I called her. We met that afternoon at her office, a small but professional place with shelves full of legal books and certificates on the walls. I told her the whole story, from the beginning, how Arthur had moved in temporarily and never left, how I'd been paying for everything for 4 years, how Brian had stopped working, and finally what had happened the day before. Sandra listened carefully, taking notes. And when I finished, she told me I had a very strong case, both for a restraining order and for eviction, and possibly a civil lawsuit for the expenses and for the assault. She explained the process to me. First, we needed to gather evidence, bank statements showing that I'd been paying for everything, text messages or emails where they admitted that I covered expenses, testimonies if there were friends or family who could confirm the situation, photos of my injuries from the push. I told her I had almost all of that, because as an accountant, I'm pretty organized with my financial documents, and I'd taken photos of the bruises that had appeared on my hip, arm, and shoulder. Sandra told me the next step was to file an eviction petition, because even though the house was in my name, legally we needed to follow the correct process to get them out. We could also file a civil lawsuit against Arthur for assault and for the expenses accumulated over 4 years, and against Brian for his share of the expenses too. I asked her how long all this would take, and she said the eviction could take between 4 to 6 weeks depending on how cooperative they were, and the civil lawsuit could take several months, but it was worth trying. I spent the next few days gathering all the evidence Sandra needed. I printed 4 years of bank statements, highlighted every rent payment, every grocery purchase, every utility bill. I searched through my email and found messages where Brian asked me for money for different things, where Arthur sent me lists of things he needed from the grocery store, assuming I would buy them. There was one particularly revealing message from Brian from like a year ago where he said, "Thanks for everything you do for us. I know it's not easy maintaining the house by yourself, but I promise things will get better soon." That was basically a written admission that I was maintaining the house alone. I included everything in a folder that I brought to Sandra. She reviewed it and said it was perfect, that we had more than enough evidence. While all this was happening, Brian called me constantly, left voicemails asking when I was coming back, saying I was overreacting, that his dad didn't mean to hurt me, that he just pushed me without thinking, as if that made it better. I sent him a text message saying I wasn't coming back, that he should talk to my lawyer if he had anything to say, and I blocked his number after that because I didn't want to keep hearing his excuses. Arthur also tried to contact me a couple times. More aggressive messages asking when I was going to pay the next electricity bill because it was about to be due. Like he still expected me to keep paying for everything even after what he'd done. I blocked them both and moved forward with the plan. Sandra filed the eviction papers and the civil lawsuit a week after our first meeting. She hired a process server to deliver the documents personally at my house. I wanted to make sure they received them officially and legally. The server went on a Tuesday afternoon, knocked on the door, Arthur opened it, and when he handed him the papers and explained what they were about, Arthur literally tore them up in front of the server and told him to leave. The server, an older guy who according to Sandra had done this 1,000 times, stayed calm and explained to Arthur that tearing up the papers didn't invalidate the order, that the legal process would continue anyway, and that he had 30 days to vacate the property. Arthur slammed the door in his face. The server sent us a complete report of what had happened, including the fact that Arthur had destroyed the documents, which, according to Sandra, only made him look worse before the court. During those weeks of waiting, I started looking for a new place to live, because I knew I didn't want to go back to that house even after they left. There were too many bad memories there. I found a small but nice apartment in a newer area of the city, a building with security and everything. I liked it immediately. I applied, got approved quickly thanks to my stable job and credit history, and signed the lease. The plan was to move there with my essential things first, while the eviction process continued, and then decide what to do with the house, probably sell it to close that chapter completely. I hired a moving company to go to my house at a specific time, when I knew Brian and Arthur would be there. I wanted to get my stuff out, without having to interact with them directly, but I also wanted them to know I was serious about all this. The movers arrived on a Wednesday morning. I was with them in my car. When we got there, Brian immediately came out of the house asking what was happening. I told him I was coming for my things, the furniture I'd bought, my clothes, my personal belongings. Arthur also came out, still with that defiant attitude, saying I couldn't take anything until the court decided that this was still his house as much as mine. I showed him a copy of the eviction papers and told him the house was in my name, that legally everything inside that I'd bought was mine, and that he had no right to stop me. The movers started working, taking out my bed, my desk, my books, my clothes, Practically everything that was in my room, plus some things from the common areas that were definitely mine, like the microwave I'd bought last year and the coffee maker I'd brought from my previous apartment. Brian tried to stop one of the workers who was carrying my TV, saying that TV had been bought together, which was a total lie because I'd bought that TV with my credit card before I even met him. I told him to get out of the way or I'd call the police, and he finally moved aside. The move took like 3 hours. In the end, the house looked practically empty because it turned out I'd bought like 80% of everything that was there. The movers took everything to my new apartment. I followed them, and we spent another hour arranging the boxes and furniture. When they finally left and I was alone in my new space, I sat on the floor because I still hadn't set up my bed and I felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief to finally be out of that toxic situation. Sadness because my marriage had ended in such a horrible way and because it had been 4 years of my life basically wasted. The 30 days of the eviction notice passed and Arthur and Brian didn't move from the house. Sandra had warned me this might happen, that a lot of people ignored eviction orders thinking the problem would go away on its own. So we already had the next step prepared. We filed a motion with the court for a forced eviction order, and the judge, after reviewing all the evidence we'd presented, approved it immediately. They scheduled a date for the sheriff to go to the house and physically remove Arthur and Brian if they hadn't left by then. That date came 2 weeks later. Sandra and I went, too. She said it was important for me to be present as the property owner to confirm they didn't have permission to be there. The sheriff arrived with 2 more backup officers. They knocked on the door. Brian opened it, and when he saw the sheriff, his face completely changed. The sheriff explained the situation to him, that they had a court order to evict them, that they needed to leave immediately and take only what they could carry, that the rest of their belongings would be placed on the curb and they'd have 24 hours to pick them up before they were considered abandoned. Brian tried to argue, saying they had nowhere to go, that this wasn't fair. But the sheriff told him that wasn't his problem, that they had a legal order and they were going to enforce it. Arthur came out at that moment and started yelling, calling me everything, saying I was an ungrateful bitch, that he was going to sue me, empty threats that everyone ignored. The officers gave them 20 minutes to pack. Essentials. Brian packed some suitcases quickly. Arthur moved slower, still grumbling and shooting me hateful looks. When they finally came out, Brian approached me, and for a moment I thought he was going to apologize, that he'd finally understand what he'd done wrong. Instead, he said, "I hope you're happy. You destroyed my family." I laughed, a bitter laugh without humor, and told him, "I didn't destroy anything. Brian, you destroyed this yourselves when you decided it was easier to live off me than to be responsible adults, when your father attacked me and you defended him instead of being on my side." I told him that family, real family, supports each other, doesn't take advantage and abuse the other person until leaving them dry. He didn't say anything else, just grabbed his suitcases and walked toward a car he'd apparently parked on the street, Arthur following behind him. They got in and left, and I stood there in front of my house. Well, the house that was technically still, legally mine, although I'd already decided to sell it, feeling like a giant weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The officers helped take out the rest of Arthur and Brian's belongings and put them on the curb like they'd said, garbage bags full of clothes, some old furniture they'd brought when Arthur moved in, boxes of random stuff. Sandra had brought a locksmith who changed all the locks on the house immediately, gave me the new keys, and that was it. The house was officially mine again. Only mine, with no one else living there without contributing, no one else taking advantage of me. I decided not to go in that day. I wasn't emotionally ready. So Sandra and I left. She told me the civil lawsuit was still in process, that we'd probably have a court date in a few months, and that she'd keep me informed of any developments. The following weeks were strange, like being in limbo. I kept living in my new apartment, going to work, trying to get back to a normal routine, but everything felt different. I'd been so used to being constantly stressed, worried about money, annoyed by the situation at home, that now that all that was over, I didn't know how to feel. I started going to the gym after work, something I hadn't been able to do before because I always got home late and tired, and that helped. I also started reconnecting with friends I'd been losing over those 4 years because I was so consumed by my situation at home that I didn't have energy to socialize. We'd go out to dinner, go to the movies, simple things, but that felt incredible after so long not doing anything for myself. The court date for the civil lawsuit finally came, like 4 months after the eviction. Sandra had prepared a very solid case, presented all the financial evidence I'd gathered, showed the text messages, the photos of my injuries, the process server's report about the eviction incident. Arthur and Brian had a lawyer, a pretty mediocre one, who tried to argue that I'd voluntarily offered to support them, that it was my responsibility as a wife to support my husband. Ridiculous things the judge clearly didn't buy. The judge reviewed everything, asked some questions, and in the end ruled in my favor on almost everything. He ordered Arthur to pay compensation for the assault, and both Arthur and Brian were ordered to pay a portion of the expenses accumulated over the 4 years. Obviously, it was a reduced amount because the judge knew they had no way to pay everything, but the principle was what was important. He also approved my divorce petition that Sandra had filed simultaneously with everything else, citing irreconcilable differences and financial abandonment. I walked out of court that day feeling vindicated. I'd probably never see all that money they were ordered to pay me because Arthur and Brian clearly didn't have the means, but it didn't matter so much. What mattered was that the legal system had recognized that what they'd done to me was wrong, that I'd been the victim in this situation, and that I deserved justice. I put the house up for sale shortly after, hired a real estate agent who listed it at a fair price. The market was decent at that time, and the house sold in less than 2 months. After paying off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, I was left with a considerable amount of money that I put in savings, thinking maybe someday I'd use it for a down payment on a new house, or maybe to travel, or just keep it there as a safety cushion. A few weeks ago, I ran into Brian at the supermarket. Of all possible coincidences, I was in the cereal aisle when I saw him. He looked different, thinner, with a beard he didn't have before. He saw me, and for a second it looked like he was going to approach, but I just kept walking like I hadn't seen him. I had nothing to say to him. There was no point in any conversation. I heard later from a mutual friend that Arthur and Brian had finally gotten jobs, basic things at restaurants and stores, because they had no other choice when they realized no one else was going to support them. Part of me felt a small satisfaction knowing they'd finally been forced to be responsible adults, but honestly, most of me just didn't feel anything. I'd processed all that and moved on. Now I'm 34 years old. I live in my apartment that I love, with plants in the windows and photos of recent trips on the walls. My bank account is healthy for the first time in years because all the money I earn is for me, for my expenses, my wants, my future. I go out with my friends on Fridays. I've started dating again, though nothing serious yet, and that's okay. I'm not in a hurry. My boss offered me a promotion last month and I accepted it. More responsibilities, but also better salary and benefits. Things are good, peaceful, stable in a way they hadn't been in a long time. Sometimes I think about those 4 years and wonder why I put up with it for so long, why I didn't leave earlier. But I guess when you're in the middle of a situation like that, it's hard to see clearly. What matters is that I finally did it. I finally stood up for myself and reclaimed my life. And that's enough.